Hello, and welcome to Cherry Bekaert's GovCon podcast, where we discuss current government contracting trends, compliance matters, and best practices to guide federal contractors forward. I'm Brendan Halloran, the Senior Manager with Cherry Bekaert, and with me today is John Bula, Manager in Cherry Bekaert's Government Contractor Advisory Services Group. As part of our continuing series on contractor business systems, today we'll be talking about Earned Value Management Systems, or EVMS. Thanks for joining me today, John.
Thank you, Brendan. Glad to be here. Looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So I think we'll start just, what is, at a basic level, what is EVM and why are we talking about it today? So earned value management, just kind of by definition, is a project management methodology that integrates schedule, costs, and scope to measure project performance. Based on planned and actual values, EVM predicts the future and enables project managers to adjust accordingly. So in turn, the Earned Value Management System, or EVMS, really refers to the software, the processes, the tools, templates, and management controls that an organization uses to accomplish their earned value management. And one thing, to kind of, we'll talk about it a little bit more detail, but there is not a standard, earned value management system. There's a lot of tools that many organizations utilize that would be common, but it really does need to reflect, a little bit about the organization, how it's structured, and how you're actually managing programs. So one of the things that we've seen turn up quite a bit more recently is that EVMS is actually required or inserted into more solicitations and RFPs. And so, I know folks have seen a number of the larger solicitations where there's, various business system, if not a requirement, it may be an opportunity to actually get additional points. And so we've seen, a fair amount of activity of organizations or contractors looking to get a view around their business systems, kind of aside from the basics on accounting, but also looking at things, like estimating, purchasing, and EVMS. And so that's one area where we've certainly gotten a lot of inquiries around, should we have an EVMS in place? What does it take to get an EVMS in place? Do we actually have a need or a requirement for it? And there's, a lot of situations that might. On more practical terms, I mean, it's certainly, a useful tool, to varying degrees for a contractor's, internal program and contract management. And then if you do believe that you'll actually have a contract in the future that would have a true EVMS, clause requirement, obviously those are, instances where you'd want to be, heading down the path of getting that in place and, being able to implement it. So, John, I think it'd be good to kind of start a little bit about, what are some of the things that, from government contract perspective, what are some of the things that might make that a requirement?
Well, good points, Brendan. And to add on to yours, this is a system where we have an integrated planning and control system on all the major contracts, as you mentioned, for major acquisitions. These pertain primarily to cost and incentive type contracts, and where you need a formally validated acceptance over the $50 million threshold. So those are the formal basic requirements. But as you go into more of the surveillance, the more the government reviews and audits, there's much more detail beyond that, and I'll briefly mention those. Some of these key elements would include planning, data accumulation and reporting, change controls, material, overhead costs, subcontractors. And as you hear me, you'll notice a lot of these particular areas may come into consideration with other purchasing type systems, accounting systems, estimating systems, material management systems. So that's why this may be the more complex of all the business systems, because it takes into consideration many of the other business systems. And along with that, it's not only reconciling accounts or transactions, or going through checklists for policies and procedures, you're having to go through the DCMA crosswalk of the 32 guidelines within this particular system, and also do data system testing. And that's the more complex area, the data testing, which goes into the program structure, your program scheduling, your planning, as I mentioned before, risk, change control, and you get into certain terminology, methodology areas such as artifacts, attributes, data elements. And for example, you may have an artifact of integrated project management schedule, and within that particular artifact, within data test, you may have two data elements such as start date, finish date, actual date, and so forth. So it's a more complex part of the system where you go beyond the policies, procedures, going through those, but go on to more of the data element testing, which can be very complex, go into the hundreds of testing, for example, you may need for your system if you're required to have it. So this is an all-encompassing business system. It's a complex business system. It's very beneficial to the contractor to have in place if required, primarily. And it does touch on many key functions within a business to make it more competitive, as Brendan mentioned, on solicitations.
Yeah, good point, Sean. One of the things that I think is, certainly that you mentioned that is worth pointing out is just, it really, for one, it's, highly technical in terms of, all of the, kind of elements and drivers that are tracked as part of EV, but really, how it really kind of plugs into, accounting in terms of, what are the, the cost estimates, what are, the indirect rates, what are the, accounting practices that also have to be considered. And as you mentioned, really, in terms of kind of procurement and subcontract management, because it really does flow down and apply to subcontractors on programs that would be covered.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. One of the areas that I think we've talked through with a number of clients is, so if a program comes up for solicitation that is over the threshold, is typically kind of a longer running cost type program that may have the EVMS requirement, is what does a contractor have to demonstrate in terms of their EVMS. And I think, as we all know, it's difficult at times to have the government, whether it be DCAA or DCMA or other, come out and actually do, a review of, whichever business system in particular you're looking at. It's not always something that, a contractor can say, well, we've got a purchasing system in place and we've got an EVMS in place. Can you come review? There really needs to be that contract requirement. And so I know that can be a bit of a obstacle for a company that has EVMS in place, and but has not had the opportunity for the government to actually come in and do a comprehensive review so that they can opine on whether it's an approved system or validated. And so just some of the it's worth spending time and really understanding the solicitation clauses that associate with EVMS, in that you should not be precluded from being able to submit for a particular solicitation if it has not been reviewed by the government. You just need to demonstrate that you do have the system in place, provide system description and how you would actually implement that system on the contract, and certainly be prepared for a follow-up review, because if you're awarded, you would be subject to that. But I've certainly worked through with a couple of clients in terms of really kind of submitting what their system looks like and what the components of it are and how they'll apply it to the contract. So I think it is important for companies to understand that that there is a provision within those clauses to allow them to to be considered for award.
Yes, all very good points, Brendan. And as we mentioned before, this is one of the more complex business systems we have out there for contractors to follow. And a point I want to mention too is you brought up the threshold, or I did earlier too, of $50 million in revenue. And that's for a formal validation and acceptance. Organizations, contractors, to be compliant, it's less than a $50 million threshold. It actually is $20 million is a threshold for actually being compliant, but also having a formally reviewed, audited EVMS would go into the over $50 million threshold. So a lot of organizations want to keep that in mind too, that it's not just $50 million and it's a cutoff to be compliant, but it does go into a lower dollar value.
Yeah. That's a good point. And also to, on that, is, DCMA is really the government focal point for earned value. And, their threshold to actually, do surveillance and reviews is actually even higher than what's prescribed in the regulation. And that's really due to, certainly bandwidth and being able to support that. So, you really, to get on the, kind of the radar screen for, a formal EVMS review and surveillance, is a pretty high bar. So a lot of folks, who may be implementing EVMS, certainly, may have, what would be in a system that could be reviewed and approved, but may not get the opportunity unless it's really a significant magnitude contract and program. And, I guess as with all of them, the government can, identify a unique risk or a particular area that, might allow them to look at it kind of below those dollar thresholds. But, but certainly, where we typically see the formal programs are for, for major contracts. So John,
Yes,
yep. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
absolutely. Good points there also. And, another good area that companies or contractors want to have in place is, a properly running ERP system, because this goes into so many areas as we've been talking about, to have that integration within the organization, such as for allocations, for variance analysis, and all parts of your program. So it's a good program management tool, as Brendan mentioned before, a good project methodology tool to have in place, and just has a good business sense, even though you may not be required to have this. Maybe parts of this may be beneficial to your organization now, and as you build up maybe to larger contracts, you add on to it. But it's always good to have good project methodology and those practices in place, as Brendan mentioned earlier.
Yeah, and I know in terms of really what the the review process is for whether it's government or third party, or if a contractor's just looking at it themselves. But one of the key components really is that system description, and really there are some requirements that DoD has, certainly things that ANSI EIA 748 would warrant, in terms of really kind of crosswalking, how does your system accomplish and meet the intent of those 32 guidelines. So I know a lot of folks that we've talked with is really kind of starting with documenting what is that how does their system work, what are those management processes, what are the tools that they're actually utilizing for data and reporting. One of the areas too that I think I know that is can be pretty extensive is kind of the shift to more of really metric review and testing. And I know that looking through at least what a DCMA program, would involve there is certainly, it's fairly intensive. Any thoughts on kind of how, how the metrics look and reporting there, John?
Well, as with the EVMS system description, as you pointed out, there's various areas there, and that in and of itself would entail, for example, your program structure, your work breakdown structure, your program schedule, your baseline, your planning, your budgeting, for your control accounts and summary level packages and planning you may have, performance analysis, as we mentioned before, for variances and estimate at completion, for example, and basically the overall surveillance of your area, your system, for change control, work authorizations, as we keep talking about, very important. So those are the key areas I would see going forward, as Brendan mentioned in the system description, those key points, along with some points we mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So what are, if a, contractor's, able to, one, kind of design and implement their EVMS, what are, some of the benefits we see, for, one, having, EVMS in place, and two, if they're able to actually, have it subject to a government review, and, ultimately, certainly the hope there is to have, what they can report as an approved EVMS. Any thoughts on that, John?
Financially and operationally, we talked about the data testing. That gives a good metric, an account of your system. And of course, we won't go into the details of that, but there's many different data testing we have within the 32 guidelines of this particular system. But overall, the benefits would include a good integrated planning and control system for project and program management primarily. It gives you a real eye-opening account of all parts of your program, your contract, your major contracts in particular, for planning being one of the key functions. It also goes through, if you have any type of changing controls, any type of variances, you'll pick those out very quickly. So you want to keep very good records, good documentation on this, and have someone or various people in control of these various parts of the system, because it can be very comprehensive and complex. But it does give you a good overall sense of your management program areas and scheduling and baselines and overall program. So I would think it's a good tool in itself for managing the program overall, and a good integration of the planning and control system for the overall organization.
Yeah, yeah. No, really good points. And certainly some, some valid, benefits. It's, probably the investment, in EVMS, just in terms of, resource, effort, tools, is certainly significant. But, utilizing that, long term, can have some really good benefits and ROI for contractors. One of the things I know, we kind of mentioned it and highlighted the importance of, having that, system description and really kind of level of detail and documentation about, your EVMS. I know one of the areas that, we've looked at quite a bit for folks is, really kind of understanding and, does their system description, check all the boxes, is it adequate? Does it, provide the detail needed to understand, how you're meeting, the intent of each of those guidelines? Any thoughts in terms of, the reporting? I know that's really, kind of a key component when you're, one, trying to operate the system, and two, certainly if you're subject to review and trying to do that as kind of a snapshot of where things are on a particular contract or program. But any kind of thoughts on, what contractors should be doing or thinking about, for reporting and being able to really kind of tie out to some of those metrics and data elements, John?
Absolutely, Brendan. And again, this does take into consideration different parts of other business systems. Accounting for one, it's going to take your overhead cost reporting, your allocation reporting, your materials reporting, your variance analysis reporting, just as, very, very few examples to give. But it does go into greater detail as we keep mentioning the data testing that really is the significant part of the EVMS control areas. But again, subcontract management is going to be very key to this type of system. Materials. So overall, if you have any other systems in place, of course, that'll be beneficial for this system too. It'll just integrate right into it. But and I assume if you have EVMS, you're going to have the other business systems in place also. So that gives you somewhat of an advantage by having those systems in place along with EVMS, because it's all going to tie together, and reporting may be more of it, more volume, but it may be more streamlined as you go through each of these systems along with EVMS.
Yeah, no, that's definitely a definitely a key point. And I know as we kind of mentioned earlier too, is that it's really not just an off the shelf type of system. Not that any of the DFARS business systems are. Everything really needs to reflect what a contractor is actually doing, and some unique areas about their business or nuances of processes. But it definitely is something that takes time to really build and understand how it works, and how it needs to work. In terms of and I think that this probably some of these questions really apply to preparing for any type of business system review. But any thoughts in terms of kind of best practice, or just kind of ways to prepare, if a, contractor is looking to get their EVMS, in place, and perhaps reviewed either by, by a program, or, by, a government team. Any thoughts there, John?
Well, documentation, as we know, is very key, and the system description, as we keep mentioning, for policies and procedures and the crosswalk, be very critical, as far as being prepared. It's always going to be good to go through your policies, procedures, go through your contracts, major contracts, review those as far as requirements, and basically see how your operation is running from a reporting standpoint, as we mentioned. Do we have any type of corrective actions in other business systems that may carry over to our EVMS? So I would say, from an initial standpoint, is to review your system description, your policies, procedures, use the DCMA crosswalk as a guide to go through that. It's a good crosswalk, detailed, and then see where you stand, and then do some corrective actions as needed. And that will give you a good starting point to go forward.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, and certainly, not wanting to, jump into it, before you're, really ready, and feel like, that you would come through and really hit all of the measurements that that review program is going to look for. I know we could take a deep dive into, many different areas around EVMS, and we won't try and do it in the context of, of this podcast, but certainly look to help anyone who has follow-up questions, or particular circumstance that they want some thoughts on. I know kind of really kind of understanding and walking through all the requirements and intent of each of the guidelines is it's a fairly resource intensive process. So certainly can pick that up in more detail, and with folks as needed. Any other thoughts you want to add, John? I think we kind of covered some of the basics, at least to get the subject going. But any thoughts you have just from your experience that you want to add?
No, thanks, Brendan. As we go forward, we do see clients, as Brendan mentioned, that have this need, and the need being primarily on the data testing. That's going to be very unique, very time consuming, resource driven, as Brendan mentioned. And that's something we do with clients to streamline it as much as possible. So that would be something to look into if you do have certain areas within your system that need data testing, along with the crosswalk, of course. But specifically, the data testing will be very time consuming, very unique to organizations who may not be familiar with those terms and methodology or the actual testing and the ranges of compliance or non-compliance and so forth. We certainly will be able to help you in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah, great. Well, thanks, John. I appreciate taking the time to kind of talk about EVMS with me. And thanks everyone for joining us. If you have any questions, feel free to email John at john.bula, B-U-L-A, at cbh.com, or myself at brendan.halloran at cbh.com. And please join us again for our next podcast.